Unit 3, Lesson 1, Post-War Consumerism and the Political Climate of the 1920s. The objective: students will be able to identify the policies of Presidents Warren Harding, Calvin Coolidge, and Herbert Hoover. And our essential question: how did the administrative policies of the 1920s contribute to the economic boom period? Unit 3, Lesson 1, Vocabulary. The Roaring Twenties could be classified by a few different categories. One was when America shut itself off from the world and became an isolationist country, condemning un-American activities and closing the immigration gate, choosing instead to focus on homegrown prosperity out of fear of the past in World War I. And the Roaring Twenties can also be classified by the Booming Twenties, where there was an increase in real income and living standards for most Americans. With new consumerism and technology and entertainment available like never before, this helped hide the dangers that America's future held. Continuity of isolationism. Beginning with the Washington Naval Conference, where the United States agreed to limit their naval superiority, limit their naval arms. And moving right along into the Kellogg-Briand Pact, where Germany, France, and the United States agreed to outlaw war and focus their efforts internally at improving their own countries from within. The World Court would have made each country in a League of Nations answerable to other countries. America would have been answerable to a worldwide community. The US Senate rejected it, preferring their isolationism, preferring to focus on their own efforts. With passage of the Dawes Plan, the United States guarantees loans to Germany so they can pay war reparations throughout Europe. This Dawes Act allowed France and Great Britain to repay their war debt to America after they received the reparations from Germany. Normalcy presidents. Simpler times and the laissez-faire economics breeds destructive economic forces and policies. Republicans ruled the White House in the 1920s, beginning with the administration of Warren G. Harding from 1921 to 1923, who died in office, Calvin Coolidge from 1923 to 1929, after assuming office after Harding's death, and Herbert Hoover from 1929 to 1933. The government policies of the 1920s focused on isolationism, where the United States would stay neutral on international affairs, protectionism, where we wanted to protect the US economy from outside competition. We did this through governmental thrift programs to avoid paying or lessen the government expenditures for the same services and products, and also through the laissez-faire economic policies, where the government had little to no intervention in the US economy, preferring that the United States be run as a business. Beginning this America First motto and the return to normalcy, Warren G. Harding in March of 1920 said, "America's present need is not heroics but healing, not nostrums but normalcy, not revolution but restoration, not agitation but adjustment, not surgery but serenity, not the dramatic but the dispassionate, not experiment but equipoise, not submergence and internationality, but sustainment and triumphant nationality." The election of 1920 saw Harding defeat James Cox and Eugene Debs of the Socialist Party by a wide margin, where Harding claimed 76% of the vote. President Harding's administration had many scandals to deal with. The Ohio Gang, or Grantism, began with the Veterans Bureau chief was caught stealing bureau funds or stealing taxpayer money for personal use. The Attorney General and others in his administration and the Justice Department were found influence peddling, offering favorable legal outcomes to their friends and more harsh outcomes to their enemies. The Interior Secretary Albert Fall leased government oil reserves at Elk Falls and Teapot Dome in Wyoming to oilmen in return for $400,000 in bribes. The Teapot Dome scandal became the symbol of the Harding administration, one of corruption and failure to restore this political normalcy. President Harding died in office in 1923. Vice President Coolidge took over. The election of 1924 saw Calvin Coolidge, running on the booming economy and conservatism, win a landslide against John Davis, as Democrats split between conservatives and liberals, with the other candidate La Follette. Vice President Coolidge, incumbent President Coolidge, won the nomination with over 70% of the vote. Calvin Coolidge believed that the business of the American people is business, and he sought to extend the programs began under President Harding. The Immigration Act, also known as the National Origins Act in 1924, began to strictly limit the amount of minorities who were able to enter the country. They were designed to keep out undesirable ethnic groups and maintain America's character as a nation of Northern and Western European, or whites. The Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1928 extended the idea that countries agreed not to use war as a method of ending international disputes, including the United States, who was not a member of the League of Nations, preferring their isolationism. President Coolidge vowed to clean up Washington, D.C. and remove the Ohio gang that was guilty of so much corruption under President Harding. He was pro-business, and he appointed Supreme Court justices that supported deregulation of businesses, as in the Adkins v. Children's Hospital decision, where the Supreme Court rendered there would be no minimum wage guarantees. President Coolidge also vetoed the McNary-Hagan Farm Bill, which was a farm subsidy bill that would have maintained consumer prices and given government funds to farmers to maintain their payroll and maintain production. President Coolidge continued the policy of isolationism, refusing membership in the League of Nations, and required the European loan payments be made in full from the countries that the United States aided during World War I. The election of 1928 saw Herbert Hoover defeat Al Smith with almost 84% of the Electoral College vote. President Hoover continued this business-first policy of the previous administrations, quoted as saying, "Given the chance to go forward with the policies of the last 8 years, we shall soon be in sight of the day when poverty will be banished from this nation." Under President Hoover's watch, the United States had an increase in volunteerism, but also saw the stock market crash of 1929 and the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930. He began the policies to try to help get the United States out of the Great Depression, with the Reconstruction Finance Corporation in 1932 and the Bonus Army of 1932. The boom times of the 1920s and the post-World War I recession was replaced by a booming economy. Many of the factors include the Secretary of Treasury, Andrew Mellon, champion of the laissez-faire economic policy, which stressed relaxed regulations on businesses. This aided the new industry after the Industrial Revolution, like automobiles and electricity and advertising. and also saw with little worker protection, aided by the relaxed regulations on businesses, this era was prime for exploitation of the worker class. One of the chief tenets of the laissez-faire economic policy was one of trickle-down economics, where money flows down from upper class to the worker class. And Andrew Mellon's tax plan, where wealth creates jobs and everybody gains, thought that the money would shift from bosses to their employees. This helped and was aided by a sense of protectionism in the Fordney-McCumber tariff, which is a 35% duty or tax on farm goods, and also by government thrift. The Adjusted Compensation Act was a bonus for military veterans of World War I. And the Big Bull of Wall Street became the new rags to riches story. Mellonites, as they were often called, believers in Andrew Mellon's pro-growth formula of tax cuts and supply side and laissez-faire economics, where people were getting rich in uncontrollable ways. But there were danger signs on the horizon as individuals began buying on margins through stock speculation, and the plight of the farmers, where hundreds of banks failed nationally. And because of little regulation, there was tremendous growth of America's debt. You could see from the chart in front of you the Dow Jones and the New York Stock Exchange margin debt between 1926 and 1935. And you can see the sharp increases beginning in February of 1926 all the way up to August of 1929, where the Dow Jones Blue Point peaked at around 380, and it came crashing down just after in the stock market crash of 1929, crashing to half of its former value. These economic policies, popular in the 1920s, were greatly aided by Andrew Mellon's pro-growth plan, where the marginal tax rate, the taxes paid, and the tax shares for those with incomes over $100,000 at the time shifted dramatically, where in the 1920s, the marginal tax rate was around 60%. That fell all the way down to 25% in 1925. You can also see the share of taxes rising, also the tax paid in billions of dollars rising precipitously during that time period. You can see from this chart documenting the gross national product per capita between 1919 and 1930. You can see the exponential growth happening beginning in 1921, increasing the gross national product from 4,500 all the way to 5,700 or 5,800 in 1929, an increase of approximately 33%. And this chart here shows us again the Dow Jones Industrials from 1915 to 1940, with a low point in 1921 of 64, increasing almost 500% to the high point in 1929 of 381 points, primarily because of the speculative trading and the margin trading that was taking place because of the deregulation of the stock market. The 1920s was an era of hope versus disillusionment, where the United States was claiming to have the world's highest standard of living, and there was no way like the American way, while tens of thousands of Americans in every major city were left standing in bread lines and food lines, looking for work or just their next meal on a daily basis.